Hello, everyone. My name is Gorecki. I'm an electrical engineer focused on embedded systems and circuit board design. My goal with this podcast is to talk to interesting people from my life about engineering, technology, and their experiences. My guest today is Matt Vasquez. Matt studied electromechanical engineering at Cal Poly and is well known for his multiple appearances on BattleBots, the famous TV show hosted by the Discovery Channel. Matt is the team captain, driver, and one of the main engineers on his family's robot, Whiplash. Matt has been consistently described as one of the best drivers in the competition, and my conversation with him today focuses on what his experience with bots has been like. Thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoy this conversation. All right, so basically, I wanted to have this conversation because everybody, when talking about bots, everyone kind of focuses on like the stats and the competitions. And I grew up, I did bots IQ in high school, and so I kind of know how a lot of that goes. But I know a lot of the behind the scenes stuff for building the bot and everything. So I just kind of wanted to talk to you about. I wanted to focus a little bit more on like you as an engineer and kind of like the family dynamics and everything that you've kind of your experience with bots in the show and everything. So for anybody listening, can you just give like a quick description of BattleBots, kind of how you got into it and kind of what your bot or Whiplash kind of has and what it does?
So BattleBots, it's a combat robot competition. So two people or two competitors will fight against each other with their, home-built combat robot. And when I say home-built, it's interesting because there's like a wide variety of teams from different backgrounds. So some of them are actual, building out of their garage with not much funds, and some of them have tons of funding and giant shops and all these resources. So it's a really cool competition where you have people from all walks of life put into some giant bracket of 50 robots, and you see who's the best.
Interesting. So can you quick describe kind of what your bot or your family's bot is like and what it does?
So Whiplash is a lifter robot with a vertical spinner in the arm. So I'll take it back a little bit, and like as far as BattleBots and all combat robot competitions, like all of your weapons you're limited to like mechanical weapons, the simplest way to put it. So you're allowed to have fire, which is like an exception, but you can't like throw water on your opponent. You can't you can't really put a gun on your robot or something. You can't do like everyone would be like, oh, I'll put an EMP on it or something,
Yeah, yeah.
something crazy like that. Like if you think of an idea and it would make the fight extremely boring and lame and make for an easy win, it's probably not allowed. Like that's a good way to put it. But
Are you
it's a
guys allowed to do projectiles? Because if I remember correctly, so when I did bots IQ, I think it was like you were limited to a 12-pound robot.
yeah.
And so that limited a lot of your weapon choices. But I remember I thought there were rules about you could use a projectile as long as you could like reel it back in and it was still connected. I don't know if I don't know if that's correct or not, but are there any rules for projectiles in terms of being able to reuse them?
So I think for most normal competitions like Bots IQ and like all the other more amateur events, I guess they don't allow like true projectiles. I think you can have something like tethered that you can reel back in, but it's not really too effective. At actual battle bots, you're allowed to have like full on projectiles, but there's a lot of safety concerns, and it's going to be like heavily looked at by their safety crew and team, and you're going to have to get lots of things approved. And there's only been really one projectile robot at BattleBots. It was really cool, but it's not going to, most of the time you're not going to be super competitive with that type of thing.
Yeah,
But
that was my
yeah,
experience with it was that those
yeah,
again, and I think it's the same thing. We can kind of get into it in a little bit, but the most effective seem to be basically taking up a mass and spinning it up to a very high velocity.
yeah,
And that seems to
exactly.
be very, very destructive. And
Yeah,
again, you've had a lot more experience with that, but
yeah,
that seems to be a very effective maneuver, which seems like you said with Whiplash, you have that with your vertical spinner, but you also have a lifting
yeah,
arm, which from what I've seen, that's fairly unique. Um,
yeah.
is that who kind of came up with that design initially? And actually, before we do that, let's kind of get into the history. So basically, your team is your family, and it started off with
Yeah.
your parents, correct? I don't know if you want to go
Yeah.
into a little bit of how you kind of got roped into it.
Yeah. So I guess going all the way back, my dad in like the early 2000s, like very late 90s, like 99, 2000, the BattleBots had like just been on TV for the first time, kind of, and it was becoming like maybe slightly mainstream. People knew about it, and he saw it, and he's like, I want to do that. he wasn't like an engineer or anything, but he was like a hobbyist and tinker and good with mechanical stuff. So he's like, yeah, I want to try that. And he was also into like hobbyist stuff, like RC boats and planes. So it was kind of perfect. Like BattleBots is great because you can get people who aren't engineers, but like maybe are into tinkering stuff, competing with like full-time engineers. It's pretty cool like that. But yeah, so he went, he did it, he loved it. He brought a couple of friends to help him. And then he was hooked. It's one of those things like most of the people who start competing, like they keep competing for a while. It's such a addictive, fun sport. So he kept doing it. I was like a little kid at the time. I was like 3 years old, 4 years old. So I, being a little kid, I'm like, this is the coolest thing ever. I love this. So yeah, he kept doing it. And then as I got older, he kind of stopped a little bit, like in the kind of like 2007 to like 2010 was kind of like a dark time for combat robots / battlebots. There weren't too many events going on. Like the original Comedy Central show was off the air. So during that time, he was kind of phasing out a little bit. And I was kind of getting old enough to be like, okay, like I want to do this myself. This is still fun to me. I want to go to competitions and compete. So as me and my brother got older, like we just kind of started doing it on our own, and our dad kept doing it with us. And yeah, we eventually ended up at BattleBots when it got rebooted in 2015. Yeah, and you asked how I came up with the design. So in 2015, the show BattleBots got renewed. So it had been off the air since 2002 or 2003. So that was like a big deal for everyone who was still competing at these local, more amateur events. And so everyone wanted to apply to be on the show. There were only like 24 spots or something, and there were hundreds of people wanting to compete. So I had this like Beetleweight, like 3-pound robot that had like a little chop saw on it, pretty much like a spinning saw blade on arm, and I pinned someone and like cut through their top plate. And it was super cool. So I wanted to build something like that because I thought it was kind of unique, but there were already some other larger robots like that. So I kind of figured like maybe do that but backwards. So the arm is for lifting, and the spinner is like a vertical spinner. So it's kind of the same thing, spinning weapon on an arm, but using it in a different way. And we'd never seen anyone else do that. And at the time, like when you were applying for the show, there was, I mean, the criteria they were looking for is like one, like, do you have experience? Like, will you make an entertaining robot? And two, is it something unique and different and something that'll stand out? So we chose to do that design solely for the purpose. Like, I didn't even think it was a good design, to be honest. I was just like, we just need to get accepted on the show. There were many things I probably would have rather applied with, but we just wanted to get our foot in the door. Mm-hmm. So we applied with that design. We got accepted as like an alternate. So there were like 24 spots, like full on competitors, and there were like 2 or 4 spots for alternates. So there were like overall only like 28 robots chosen, and the last 4 were alternates if someone couldn't make it or someone had to drop out or something.
Interesting.
So we went to the first season. We had a lot of fun. We didn't get into the real competition, but it was still really cool, and we loved it. And like the coolest thing is like all the people there, like we already knew all the people there because everyone who was there we'd see at other events. It's like a super small, tight-knit community.
Yeah, there are many people that do this kind of stuff. I even remember when I was in high school, like it was pretty niche, and like some of the schools, they actually had external funding, which gave them a bit of an advantage. And I remember I don't even think my school even recognized it really. It was technically a club, and then they didn't give us any money for it, and we had to basically scrape together and try to find an advisor. And basically by the end of it, we got our one of our like electronics teachers, it was for like one of the engineering classes to do it, and she's like, I don't know anything about robotics, and we're like, we literally just need you to unlock the room, like for us to work on this stuff.
Sign this paper.
yeah exactly, like be the figurehead. But yeah, that's pretty interesting. So then basically at some point you guys actually got onto the show then?
Yeah, so in 2016 we were actually fully on the show. We got accepted because they opened up more spots, so like 32 instead of 24, and there were still a lot more people applying. But yeah, we made the cut because we kind of paid our dues being an alternate. That year we did absolutely terrible. It was like the format then, it wasn't great. It was just straight up single elimination, 30 round to 32 bracket. So like tough. if like your first round something goes wrong, like you're done, and it's that's the end of your run. So
how far did you make it? Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. How far along did you make it in that competition? Was it like first match and you were out, or did you get like, how far along did you make it?
Yeah, so that one, it was like round 1 we were out. We had like dumb stuff happen. Like we had sprocket for the drive brake. We had these like double sprockets, but we bought like cheap ones, and it totally just shattered. And so we had like half our drive, and we had some other problems. So
Oh, that
yeah,
sucks.
that one went pretty poor. That was back in 2016. So then after that season of BattleBots gets, so it was on ABC at that point.
Hmm.
ABC cancels BattleBots. So in 2017, we had obviously didn't do BattleBots, but there's this other event, RoboGames, that we competed in for years, and it was like the only other heavyweight level competition. So we brought the robot from BattleBots. We kind of rebranded it a little bit, so it was a little bit different, and we just fixed the few things that went wrong at BattleBots. Like we obviously got better drive sprockets, and there were a few other things that went wrong that we addressed. And at that event, we did like incredibly well with these few little changes. We fought like some of the top robots from the last BattleBot season. We were able to beat them, and it was insane. Like we did way better than we ever thought we would do. So that event, I think we ended up being like runner up. So
Oh,
that
wow.
was super cool. So we went from like absolutely terrible to like kind of being the top of the field like within the span of 1 year.
Do you
So that kind
think
of just went to yeah.
do you think that that was like luck, or did you guys really hammer on the things that you learned from the first time and kind of seeing what other people had done? Or do you think that this was more like, I mean, obviously some of it has to be skill, but were there things that you
Yeah.
guys really worked on improving for that second season?
Yeah, it's funny. So sometimes like things will go wrong and it's truly just like a super simple thing that is like an easy fix. And the thing that sucked about the single elimination format is like that happens and you're done. And the thing with BattleBots is you can't really like your fights are really your only true tests. Like unless you want to drive it off the roof of your house or something and see what happens. Like that's you really don't know how it's going to perform until you actually fight. So experience is super important, and you could learn a lot in a really short amount of time. And also, what was great about that BattleBots event we did terrible in is at the end of the event they would allow like grudge matches. So you just go to someone and be like, "Hey, you want to fight for fun?" Like they had some extra time in one of the filming sessions, so you go do a grudge match. So we did one of those, and we actually made a few improvements there, and it worked a lot better. So we're like, "Oh man, like we wish it had worked this well for the our first fight." But yeah, so we learned a lot from that. But yeah, Robo Games, we were runner up. That was like insane. We were totally shocked we did so well. And then the year after that, BattleBots gets picked up again, this time by Discovery Channel. So we were just like, okay, like this is perfect. Like we did great at Robo Games. We have this momentum. The robots looks looks like it's working great. So we go to that season of BattleBots, and we ended up making the semifinals. So we got like third place that event. So like we were runner up at Robo Games and third place at BattleBots, and yeah, it was great. We again, same thing happened. We fought a lot of robots that were just like, oh, like we're definitely gonna lose this fight, and then we totally surprised ourselves and won. It was like it was a pretty magic event in that sense that we did so much better than we ever thought we would. And then kind of after that point, like Robo Games wasn't televised, but like people in the community watched it and like knew like, okay, like maybe we're someone to watch out for. And then I don't know, that 2018 event when they got picked up by Discovery was kind of like the event that maybe put us on the map a little bit, and like people kind of knew who we were, because like BattleBots on TV was like a huge deal because like a lot of like our friends and like because all these people are our friends that we're competing with. Like I said, such a tight knit community. Like our little community came like kind of like F-list celebrity sort of.
Yeah,
Like it's
yeah,
like
that's
every once in a
funny.
while like someone will be walking down the street and like someone will recognize you. So that was kind of crazy, like becoming more well known after that event. Yeah.
What was the experience being on TV for the first time like? Obviously there's a lot of production that kind of goes on in the
Mm-hmm.
background. And what was that experience for you? Because I mean, even with that being a few years ago, you were a bit younger, obviously.
Yeah.
Was that was that something that you had ever thought about before, or was it just something that you kind of just did without really thinking about? And what was that experience kind of like?
Uh, I don't know, like, because like the first two seasons of BattleBots, like we weren't really in the competition, and even in the second one, like we lost super early. Our fight was only like highlighted, so we weren't even really on the show. So like all the like top people on the show that at that point, like, and I was still young at that point. I was like freshman college, like senior high school, kind of. So like all those like top people were like gods in my eyes, kind of like I don't know. A lot of them like I'd looked up to since I was like a little kid. So yeah, it was honestly just kind of mind blowing to like be among them, after we started doing well, and be put in like the same light as them like on TV was super cool. Yeah, I don't know. I feel like even, but it's funny. Even the years we did really bad, they would film like so much stuff that like we were still in front of the camera all the time. So I feel like we kind of got used to that pretty quick, even if it wasn't like used for anything. So when the time came and we were doing well, like we already kind of had practice, and it was I don't know, it came, all that stuff came pretty easily. Like at the end of the day, like you just need to get your work done. They're gonna put a camera in front of you, and you just kind of say what you're doing, what you're thinking, and yeah, I feel like you get used to it pretty fast.
Yeah, that's
Um,
interesting. And you just brought up a point that I hadn't thought about before, but what has the experience been like? So you basically just described being, late in high school, early into college, and seeing some of these, let's say, pro builders that are
mhm,
doing probably some pretty interesting things, and you're like, wow, that's got to be crazy. How has your view changed kind of over time now that you're further along, and especially now you graduated
mhm.
college, you've been working as an engineer, and now with your
Yeah.
experience, do you feel like more, let's say, on their level where you're like, oh, I fit in here, and like I can battle with these, let's say, top builders, top engineers.
Mhm.
Have you ever even thought about that really?
I'm a little bit. I mean, I don't think I will say I'm on like the same engineering level as a lot of those people. Like a lot of them are, in their 40s, 50s, like some of them 60s. So they have decades of engineering experience. And I can't say I have the same. But the cool thing about BattleBots is it is an engineering competition, but I'd say like that's only half of or maybe a third of the battle because like there's so much more that goes into winning. And a lot of that is like having good strategy and like knowing the sport well and being a good driver and I don't know, engineering is not all of it. So like a lot of the people I beat, like I am was maybe 18, 19, like I am clearly not nearly as good of an engineer as these people, but I can still beat them because I have maybe these other traits that made a good battle bot. So yeah, a lot more than engineering goes into it. So but yeah, it was still really cool and mind blowing to be like, oh, I beat this professional engineer with this many years of experience.
Well, so that does
Yeah.
take that opens up two paths that I want to go down. I'm trying to figure out which one I want to do first. But let's say I'm going to go down more of the bot side first, and then we'll come
Mhm,
back to you as an engineer. But one of the things that I feel like I saw a lot. So I was doing some research, watching a bunch of the battles
mhm.
and reading some articles, and it looks like you're consistently kind of described as one of the best drivers on the show. What are your thoughts on that, and how do you feel like you got to that point? Do you practice driving a lot? Are you just familiar with the way your bot handles? Like, why do you think that you kind of come out on top there?
I'm a. It's a funny question. So it's so in my okay. So on the show, they will say a lot of the time like, oh, like Matt Vasquez won over the best driver in the sport. But I feel like it's really really hard to like say who the best driver is because one, there are so many different types of robots,
Yeah.
and they all do different things. So a lot of them, like a lot of the great drivers are driving like just a simple, four-wheel drive vertical spinner, which is like kind of the most simple apex design that if you build that and you build it well, like you will probably do well, that design type. So a lot of those people do really well and like they're great drivers, but at the end of the day, they just kind of have to point and shoot really. And whereas with Whiplash, there's kind of a lot more going on. We have the lifter and the spinner. So like a lot of the time, the spinner really isn't our main weapon. I'd say it's the lifter, and that involves me having to like get under some specific corner of the robot, lift them, prop them against the wall very carefully. So Whiplash is one of the few robots that like has like touch to it is a good word to say. Like it's not just like smash them as hard as you can. It's like carefully get into this angle and carefully place them on this part of the robot that they can't get off of or something like that. So I think I guess watching the way Whiplash works makes it seem like I am, a good driver, and I think it's just the kind of the nature of the robot and just me being able to control it. And it's funny, and a lot of the time, BattleBots comes down to like who can get under the other one, whose robot is lower to the ground, who can get really like a lifter robot. How it works is you have to scoop them up and flip them over. If you can't scoop them up, you can't flip them over. Your weapon doesn't work. And a lot of the vertical spinners, they will have forks or something in front of their weapon to like lead them into that tooth. And if you can't get under them, you can't do that. So a lot of the like our most dominant fights, I was just like, we are clearly lower than this person. I can get them from any angle I want and play with them like a chew toy. Even if we're not going to like the most damaging robot, I can still like manipulate them like crazy if I could get underneath them. So a
Yeah.
lot of those fights, like we had like this design advantage, and I was able to just like do all this crazy stuff because I knew like, okay, it's pretty unlikely they're able to really hurt me. unless I make some big mistake. So a lot of the time that makes it look like my driving is like absolutely insane, like bonkers, crazy good. But I mean, to an extent, I think we do things that other people don't do and, are impressive. But yeah, a lot of it comes down to like who can get under the other robot first.
That's an interesting point because yeah, from my experience, kind of like what you said, getting under the bot when I was doing it
Mhm.
was even on the small scale, it's still the same
Yeah,
the same idea that you want to get under and then try to either drive them into your weapon or flip them over. Those are
yeah,
the pretty much the most effective ways of doing it. Now there's a couple battles where you end up going up against a bot where they've got basically shielding dragging along the ground.
yeah,
That's a rough I watch some of those fights, especially when they're angled out, and that gets pretty
yeah,
tough to beat those guys.
yeah.
At that point, do you just kind of say like, well, there isn't much we can do here, or do you really try to do you change your strategy at all, or is it
At that point, you try to, I mean, if you see that they totally have that advantage, then you try to outdrive them, get around them. But that is a really, really difficult thing to do because, like, when someone has that advantage, all they have to do is sit there and point at you. And if they can point their front at you, then they can win the fight. So it's really, really hard to like get to the back or the sides when your opponent knows that all they have to do is sit in the middle and just face you, and then you can't do anything about it. So
yeah.
like the two robots that have kind of done that to us is one is like Bite Force, who is like a 3-time champion who's been retired for a few years now. And the other one is Endgame, which is like the most recent #1 ranked robot. And we fought them in the 2020 finals. It was funny. The 2020, so Bite Force was like the champion. They were 2015 champion, 2018 and 2019 champion. So they're like they'd only ever lost once,
Hmm.
and they had like 20, 30 wins, something crazy like that, and we lost to them twice. So they were just a super simple vertical spinner. I'm trying to see if I have. It's funny. There's a so another funny fact. There are BattleBots toys you can buy, and I'm trying to see if we have a bunch of them lined up on this desk, but no Bite Force toy.
Oh,
But
okay.
it's yeah, just 4 little wedgelets, vertical spinner, and it was just super great design. Like no one really knew like why it was such a great robot at the time, but part of the reason was it was just so low to the ground. Like those front wedgelets on the front of the robot just scraped the floor perfectly. They weren't too low to where they were hitting every seam in the floor. They were just high enough where you can drive well, but also no one could get underneath them. So we had that like perfect balance.
Well, that's where it gets
Yeah.
interesting too, because if a lot of your weapons are the vertical spinners, if
Mhm.
you take your armor and you angle it outwards at
Mhm.
any angle basically instead of just a flat side, that gives it a lot less area to catch on. And so
Yeah.
even though you can still do damage to your outside armor, but your odds of getting lifted off the ground become a lot lower.
Yeah.
So that's interesting. Um,
Yeah. So after Bite Force retires, well, people didn't really know he was going to retire. So in 2020, like Bite Force is the reigning champion. They don't compete, but everyone was thinking like, how do we beat Bite Force? Like, how do we beat this seemingly unbeatable robot? And there were kind of 3 teams that came up with the same answer, and we were one of them. And that was have like forks on your robot. So instead of these wider wedgelets, these just longer strips of steel with a very sharp end, most likely hinged, just riding flat on the floor. And we're like, okay, with this type of design, we can scoop them up and use our weapon. So the 3 teams that kind of brought that to the next season were us, Whiplash, we brought that. Another robot, Tantrum, who had like a breakout season that year, and they were the 2021 champion. And then Endgame, who was the 2020 champion, the champion of that season. So all 3 of us kind of we did extremely well. Like all of us made it to the semifinals. Endgame fights Tantrum in the semifinals, beats Tantrum. Then we fight Endgame in the finals, and Endgame beats us. But us and Tantrum are kind of thinking like we'll just do the fork thing, like this will beat Bite Force's idea. But Endgame was kind of thinking a step ahead, and they're like, we're not only going to have forks to beat Bite Force, but we're going to have forks that are 6 inches longer than those forks, and ones that are 6 inches longer than those ones, and so on. So Endgame kind of they like us and Tantrum kind of like foresee like maybe this is how we could beat Bite Force, but Endgame was just like no, this is how we are going to win BattleBots and beat everybody. So we
Interesting.
go into the Endgame fight, and like their reach was like 6-8 inches longer than ours. So I'm just like okay, like we are either or the only way we win this is if we outdrive them, like and outdrive them like a lot, like not just a little bit. Like we have to totally own them, otherwise we will get killed.
Yeah.
And we ended up getting slaughtered in that match. Like so, yeah, it was like so close but so far. Like we made it to the finals and then just got obliterated. And they took home the giant nut. They were the champion. So
Yeah.
yeah, but yeah, it's funny. That's still kind of the strategy. It's kind of getting to the point people are pushing the limit of that fourth ground game, and like some people can't even get out of their square, their solo to the ground.
Right,
So
right.
it's there's a fine balance now, and I feel like it's gotten to the point like everyone's has it, so no one has it now. So yeah,
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what people come up with next. To kind of, it's like come up with a new weapon, then you learn to counter that weapon, and then you come up with a
yeah,
new weapon and count. So it's kind of a cat and mouse.
yeah,
To take this in another direction here, and to focus back on kind of you guys on the engineering side of things.
yeah,
What was it like growing up with your dad kind of doing all this stuff? Because one thing my dad's a mechanical engineer, and I grew up
yeah,
always having, my basement was full of tools and workbench,
mhm,
and just I
yeah,
was always used to being able to fix and build stuff. And
mhm,
I remember being in my freshman year of high school, and in one of the books we were reading, there was a description about a metal file, and
mhm.
nobody in my class knew what a file was. And I'm like, what do you mean? Do you guys like not have an entire set of these sitting in your basement like I do? It was just kind of funny. And I realized that
Yeah.
like that seemed particularly unique for the people around me. So what was it like being a young kid and kind of having your dad building this stuff? Was
Yeah.
that, I mean, I imagine it was a good learning experience, but also,
Mhm.
um, yeah, if you could just kind of riff on what that was
Yeah.
like.
Yeah. It's kind of funny. Like you said, the thing about the file, like my brother, who's like a few years younger, has made the joke, like, oh, when he was a little kid, he's like, what? Everyone just doesn't have a whole workshop and robots in their garage. Like he just thought it was normal. But no, it's definitely not for everyone. But yeah, no, it was definitely cool being around that stuff. Like I think so it's funny, like BattleBots, like a lot of the people who are, older competitors were engineers. They saw BattleBots, they're like, oh, I'm an engineer, I can do that. But like me and a lot of the younger people was the exact opposite. Like we saw BattleBots, we're like, that looks fun, I want to do that. Now I'm going to become an engineer because of it. So that's, I think, in the simplest terms, that's kind of what happened. Like I saw BattleBots and was like, okay, I want to do this, and then you go, okay, so how am I going to build this robot? And then you kind of like a bunch of builders have referred to it as like stealth learning, where you're just trying to do this thing, you want to do it really bad, and along the way you're like accidentally picking up all these skills so you could accomplish this thing.
Yeah, I
I'm
mean
a
that's
Yeah,
I that's a great term for it. And honestly,
mhm,
like that resonates so much with me because I do the same
yeah,
thing where it's like I would pick projects that I just thought were cool, and then
mhm,
I'd learn the things that I needed to learn in order to do it. And if you just keep doing that, suddenly it's amazing how much you can learn when you actually want to do it versus when
yeah,
somebody's telling you you have to do it.
yeah,
Um, and one thing, looking back, I think some people really get stuck with where they want to go in life. They have a bunch of choices. They could go in any direction. They're
mhm,
interested in a whole bunch of things. And I was looking back at kind of my experience, and I realized that I was probably always going to be an engineer. I
yeah,
always grew up building stuff. I always enjoyed tinkering, and there was never, for me, it never felt like there was any other choice. I was like, this
mhm,
is what I want to do. And so I'm
yeah,
curious, like, do you feel like growing up and seeing that it kind of set that path for you? Do you think that fits well with your kind of your temperament as well?
yeah. Oh, for sure. I think I remember like even in like kindergarten, like we did something like, what do you want to like be when you grow up? And I like don't even know if I really knew what like an engineer was necessarily, but I was just like, I just like want to build stuff. Like that was kind of how I put it. So I think it was a yeah, I really think there was no question for like for as long as I can remember. I'm and I'm sounds like you're in like a similar boat.
Yeah, I mean,
But
it's
yeah,
that's been my experience, which was
yeah,
like, and I think with my dad being an engineer, and he was always fixing stuff, always not necessarily building new stuff. Sometimes he would do that too, but often he
yeah,
was fixing a lot of things, and
mhm,
I would help him out because he always needed an extra hand. And I kind
yeah,
of picked that up and just learned a lot doing that. And then
mhm,
along the way, I started really enjoying the creative side of it as well, and just creating new
yeah,
things. And then as you start to pick up the skills of like designing electronics or like learning how to machine stuff, the
mhm,
world just keeps opening up in
yeah,
the way that you can think about what you can do next. And
Yeah.
I think especially as I got into college, that just kind of exploded for me. So
Yeah. And it's funny, like even going back to when I was like my dad first started doing BattleBots, I was a little kid. Like obviously I'm not going to be using a drill press when I'm 6 years old, but like once I was a little bit older, like I don't know, like middle school, maybe early high school, like there are a lot of like small combat robot competitions, like what you did, the 15-pound bot IQ, or like there's like 3 pound and 1 pound events. So back when I was in like my early teen years, like I was super into doing that. And like that was also the time like my dad was like, okay, like learn to use like shop tools and stuff, and like, you know, using like a bandsaw and drill press. I was like, holy crap, like I've opened up like this world of opportunity of things I can build. Like I can just, design this robot on paper and build it whenever I want. Like that's kind of mind blowing being able to say like, you know, in 1 week, like I can build this thing by myself. Like
yeah, I
that's
mean, it's
pretty
like
cool.
it's
Yeah.
like the mad scientist version of it, where it's like y- the more you figure out how to do, the more you can
Yeah.
just think of something and create it.
Yeah.
And that to me was so liberating to be able to think up an idea, a design or something I was doing, and then to realize that I could actually go, provided the money and time and resources. But
Yeah.
if those weren't really factors, it's like
Mm-hmm.
there was nothing stopping me from mentally being able to put this thing together and to create it
Yeah.
out of thin air. And I still think that that's one of the coolest things.
Yeah.
You can solve so many interesting problems that way, and I find it really exciting. But
Yeah, no, and I was super lucky in the sense like my dad had all these tools, like our garage workshop, he just slowly built up over the years. So like all that stuff like was accessible to me, or at least like in the beginning, like we had like a bandsaw and drill press and like some, smaller stuff like that. But that you could do so much with that. I mean, really. And we had for what I wanted to do, like I had everything I needed really. And then like over the years, like when we started doing BattleBots, and like BattleBots is getting a little bit more popular, and like we're actually getting like sponsorship money and like some prize money and all this stuff. Like a lot of that, I don't know. I think any profit really just went to like building out our shop, and a lot of that was just like for this build season, we want to do this thing. We need this tool to do it. We're gonna buy this tool to do it with this stipend we have, and so yeah, that slowly built up our shop over the years. Where now we have like a nice size manual lathe, and we have like a Bridgeport in our garage, and so yeah, that's also been a cool part of it, like slowly growing our home shop along the way.
yeah, that's the dream, is to have a very nice shop. I think that's maybe not every engineer, but a lot of people I know, they either
Yeah,
want it or they have it. So
yeah.
um kind of going into that a little bit, then working with your family, how has that been in terms of the few seasons now that you guys have kind of done together? I imagine it brings you guys a lot, like pretty close together. Are there any times that it creates splits as well, whether that's deciding you guys want to do different designs, or maybe some of the stress of just doing the show, or even just general life, like if you guys are all busy with work and school
Yeah.
and then trying to build a bot, does that ever create strain for you guys as well?
I think all those things you listed like do to an extent. I mean, BattleBots, like getting ready for BattleBots is normally like a relatively stressful experience, just because like for one, the show normally isn't renewed and there's not a date announced until like 3 months before the filming,
Oh
which
wow.
is like no time at all. So like once like they tell you to go, like you need to start going. So yeah, it can get stressful at times, and like sometimes like we all butt heads on certain things, or like at the event we're going through some super stressful, fast-paced repair. But I don't know. I think it's overall been like a good thing. Like sometimes like any like tension there's been, like we've just kind of like learned to deal with it and like all learned to work together really well. I think like even more than with my dad, I think like me and my brother have learned to work really well together because of it. And it's funny, like in the early years, like when we were both early teens, my brother was even younger. He was like 10 or something, and competing in these like smaller weight classes. Like we would be competing against each other all the time, and like that was an interesting dynamic. Like now, I don't think we would ever think like this, but back then we like legitimately like did not want to lose to each other. Like we
That's
had our like little kid egos.
that's
But
interesting because
yeah,
I don't have I've got one sister, but
yeah,
I never had any brothers. And so
uh-huh,
from what I've seen, sometimes there can be some pretty serious competition there, especially
mhm,
between an older and younger brother.
yeah.
How old or how much younger is your younger brother?
See, right now I'm 24 and Jason is 21, so we're a few years
Okay.
apart.
Okay,
Yeah,
but just enough to make it competitive though.
yeah,
Um, that's
yeah.
interesting. So how was that then, going from kind of, because I imagine, especially, he's always been your younger brother, so I
Yeah.
imagine at some point, you'll kind of wave him off as your younger brother, but then at some point when you start working together on a team, what's it been like to start to work together on a team, and you kind of have to take him, let's say, a little bit more seriously than maybe you did
Yeah.
previously?
Yeah. And I think a lot of it is just like maturing as we get older. But yeah, I think the last few years we worked like really well together. And I think more than like building for the season, I think we work even better together, like at the actual event, like in the pits preparing. Like we both know like what we're capable of. So like we can easily say like, can you like go do this thing? Well, I do this thing. Like that's another thing about our team. We're spread pretty thin. Like we really only have 3 people working in the pits, which is quite a few more people than most teams. So I think we know our strengths and weaknesses really well. And like we know like you go to do this thing, take care of this thing, I'll do this thing, take care of this thing, and you go take care of that thing. Then we can meet in the middle, and like it works out most of the time. So
Yeah.
I think like having that kind of trust that we can all get our jobs done is pretty important, and comes with being so close to each other at all times. Really.
It's
Yeah.
really interesting that you say that, actually, because a couple of the guys I talked to last weekend, I know them from back from Wisconsin, and they're three brothers who they started an airplane company where they're building.
Yeah.
It's basically an airplane kit that consumers will be able to buy. Um, and it was interesting because I asked them a similar question of like, what has it been like working as brothers on this experience? And they gave a very similar answer, which is like, from living together and from having grown up together, we just have this trust and this bond, really, that they wouldn't feel comfortable having with other people, whether it was even friends or coworkers, let's say. And so it's really interesting because I imagine that allows you to be more effective, um, than a lot of people seem to be. So that's really interesting that you say
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. And it's funny because like thinking back to like the years when we were like younger, early teens, like fighting each other in these small competitions and like super competitive with each other. Like we haven't really fought each other in like ages. But it's funny, in 3 weeks, the event Robo Games I mentioned is coming back, and we're both going to be competing at that, both in the heavyweight weight class with our own robots. So that'll be funny if we end up fighting each other again after all these years. And I don't know, because I feel like back then we were like, I want to beat you, I want to beat you, but now I don't think either of us really care who wins.
How do you
Yeah.
that's pretty interesting.
Yeah.
How do you guys handle that? Because you don't want each other. Are you guys going to know what each other's designs are going into it?
Well, I mean, they're
Or
both sitting in our garage right now, so
okay, I didn't know. I didn't
we
know how
clearly
it.
know. Like, yeah, I'm a yeah, and that's another thing. Like in BattleBots is like very competitive. Like there are some people, there's like more few of them who will get their robot ready, cover it with a tarp, have it sit in their pit area, no one can see what it is until it's time to fight. And there's others like we're more in the camp of just like we're just gonna let it sit out there. And it's funny because like in BattleBots there's this like game of like configurations where people will have different setups for different opponents, and like they don't want their opponent to know what they're running until right at the fight because they don't want them to be able to prepare for it. So it's like
Mm.
kind of gotten to the point like a lot of the time what I'll do is like I'll see our like opponent like going in our pit trying to see what we're doing, and I'll just set the robot up there like exactly as it is. And that's almost like playing more of a mind game than actually like covering it up because they're like, there's no way they're actually leaving like their real configuration out for us to see. They're totally doing something different.
That's funny. Yeah, they're gonna switch it out at the last minute.
Yeah.
That's really funny. How seriously does everybody take it? Because I imagine there are some people who are like, we're just here for fun. We don't even care about being on TV. Like, this is just a cool
Yeah.
experience, and we're glad we're part of it. And then I imagine there's some teams that are like, we want to win. We are here to
Yeah.
win, and we are going to do it at like, how does that? What's that
Yeah.
experience like? And does it lean one way or the other?
I think it's relatively there's like a spectrum, I think, and I think it's relatively even. Whereas like maybe half the field is like moderately competitive to like their hard maybe okay, I'd say maybe more people are competitive than not. I think everyone wants to win to an extent, but there's some people who are maybe take it more seriously than others. Um uh but yeah, it's really interesting because you have some teams that are spending 100,000, 200, $300,000 or whatever every year, and some that are spending, maybe the more middle range, like 20 to 50 grand, which is like maybe closer to us, and some spending a lot less than that. Um, uh, but yeah, it's definitely gotten really competitive over the years, and it's gotten so destructive. Like I remember in the earlier like 2015, 2016 seasons, there were only two or three really destructive robots. So like, and at that time it was single elimination anyway. So if you fought one of those robots, you got destroyed. It was fine because you're done. You're not competing anymore. But now it's like I think 2016 was the first season where this robot Bronco, which they were a super high ranked robot back then, flipper robot, they brought two robots. They brought two identical copies of their robot. And everyone was just like, what the heck is this? Like, is this even allowed? Like, can you do this? And like, there was nothing in the rules that really said you couldn't, but it was like kind of frowned upon at that time and people weren't so happy about it. But then come season 3, more teams are bringing identical copies of their robots. And now it's gotten to the point, it's so destructive that everyone has so many fights. You have 4 fight card rounds, then go in the bracket. So you're guaranteed at least 4 fights, which is a lot of matches. And if you get destroyed 3 times or 4 times, that's a lot of work you're gonna have to do if you don't have enough spares. So now the production actually encourages. They're just like, will you be there prepared with at least 2 copies of your robot?
Oh, that's
So
interesting. That's interesting to
yeah,
see how that's changed.
yeah. So it's and a lot of that is like they just need their show to run smoothly. They need to be able to fit because the thing's over 2 weeks. They have to be able to have, you know, I don't know, 15, 20, like 20 fights per day. So if they can't do that, they don't film. They don't film the whole season.
They're
So
having
they need to
20
make.
they're having 20
I,
fights per day.
Yeah, and I mean most events will have a lot more than that. BattleBots is different because it's filming for a TV show, so there's breaks in between. But normally there's 2 filming sessions with like 8 to 10 fights per session, sometimes more. So
Wow.
yeah, it's a lot of fights. And normally you'll fight like every other day or so, roughly. Um, uh, but yeah, so they're really encouraging people to bring as many copies of the robot as they can, and that makes it's like BattleBots inflation. Like that makes it more expensive for everyone. The designs are getting more destructive, which makes it more expensive for everyone, and it makes it more competitive. So yeah, it's not cutthroat in the sense that like for the most part everyone's friends and like there's no bad blood between people, but it's competition wise, it's like very cutthroat where like people are very, very prepared, and it's like getting to the point. It's like NASCAR, like F1 level, like
It's high level, yeah.
sponsors, and yeah, it's very, very high level for sure.
Are you excited to have watched it grown in that way? And do you feel like do you want it to keep continuing that way, or would you rather it kind of stay where it is?
It's an interesting question because like it's in my eyes, it's really cool seeing the sport get to this level. Like these teams having these many sponsors and spending this much money and having crazy high quality in machines. But at the same time, like is this sustainable? Like, is there enough demand for this show where the show can pay builders enough to continue doing this and we can get sponsors? Like, are there enough people watching that justifies this level of competition? And I feel like we're just at that hairy edge of like sustainability wise.
Hmm.
So like some people have said like, why don't we just do 30-pound robots instead and put it on
Right.
TV? They can't tell the size anyway, people watching it on TV. I'm
It's
yeah.
interesting because you made the point of being something like an F1 pit crew, and I'm just imagining like the amount of engineering that goes into those races is insane.
Mhm.
And I don't even want to
Yeah.
know how much money is flowing in and out of that enterprise. But
Yeah.
I'm imagining if bots were to get to that point, like
Mhm.
I have to imagine you could build some pretty crazy stuff if you had something like the amount of sponsors and the teams that you're seeing in like F1. That I imagine that could be
Yeah.
pretty wild.
I mean, the thing is, like, inherently, a BattleBot costs nowhere near what an F1 car costs, but like to scale of an F1 car, like for what BattleBots is, like people are putting that level of ingenuity and engineering into it to an extent. Like, there's teams like Endgame, who's a champion, like a Tantrum and a Riptide. Like, if you look up those teams, they have teams with a lot of really skilled people spending a lot of money and just, yeah, it's crazy just the amount of resources and they have people designing like on their team designing their custom electronics, people assigned to like very specific little niches within their team. So yeah, when you get to those teams, like it's gets crazy high level, and
That's
it's very hard for some people to compete with.
that's actually amazing that you guys are competing on that level where there are teams that are doing that. And then um comparatively, it's you and your dad and your brother working out of your
Yeah,
garage. Like, it's amazing that that is even on the same competition scale. Now, granted, they might still win, let's say, but the fact that
yeah,
you can even sit in the ring with them is that's
yeah.
pretty impressive.
And like I would say we're on relatively on par with a lot of those teams, like competitiveness wise. I mean, we've been a runner up before. We've done semifinal, quarterfinal runs, and we've been known as like one of the higher ranked robots, I would say. But a lot of that comes down to just like making decisions that make our lives easier. Like just use the stock ESC that everyone else is using and copy this person's settings that has it available. And like, okay, that's one thing that's going to make our life easier, and we can focus on these other things. So it's a lot of like picking and choosing what you put your time towards. And
Because you're
I really think a lot of the time, like keeping it simple goes to your advantage, and keeps things more reliable and dependable. And yeah, I think that's kind of been what's kept us afloat, really.
Interesting. Have you guys, going back to what you previously said too, you were talking about how with the bots becoming more destructive, has
Mhm.
that changed your design where you guys are now making a lot more parts that are maybe easily replaceable or you don't care about them as much? You're like, we actually anticipate this getting annihilated, but we'll just
Yeah,
swap it out. Has that kind of informed your newer designs?
absolutely. Like 3 years ago was very different, or 3, 4 years ago was very different from now. Whereas now you have to look at everything is disposable for the most part. Like everything. Like it just needs to be mass producible. Like you can have 10 spares of this thing. Like last season, we only had time to make like two chassis, like two main chassis for the robot. Our very first fight this last season, chassis one totaled, like done. First fight, we're down to our second chassis for the remainder of the tournament. And it was like so bad, it wasn't even like repairable. Second fight, not as bad, but we take a ton of damage. And we're just like, this is so much more work now because we can't just swap to the next chassis. We have to strip the whole thing down, repair the chassis, put it all back together. So yeah, you definitely have to treat your stuff as disposable for sure. Um, uh, and there are some teams like there's this one robot Quantum from the UK, and they look at their robot as like a work of art, and it really is a work of art. It's like a hydraulic crusher robot. So instead of like spinning some 50-pound mass, 250 miles an hour, they take like a approach more similar to ours in the sense that they're more of a control robot and have to drive really well to win against any of these kinetic energy spinners. But the robot's like beautiful. It's like uses a lot of like a generative design. So if you know what that is, so like you'll take some part and you'll choose the important features, and it will cut away anything that's unnecessary and make like the most optimized part. Is the
That's
simplest
yeah,
way to put it.
that's
Yeah,
honestly crazy that they're putting that level into it. And I
yeah,
know you mentioned that they do hydraulics, and I even
yeah,
we looked at doing pneumatics for like the 15-pound robots, and it's like,
yeah,
man, this gets really complicated really quickly.
yeah.
Hydraulics sounds really cool on a robot. I think the
Mhm.
only thing I'd be concerned about would be if you do something with high kinetic energy, you just risk if you have hard lines, you risk cracking them, or if you're
Yeah,
using tubes, like ripping them. So I
yeah.
imagine I imagine it's super intricate and really cool and high level engineering, but I also imagine it's fairly fragile. But maybe
Yes.
it's not. I guess I haven't seen it.
No, you're correct, and I think the team would agree to say it's a rather fragile robot, but it is still very competitive because it's driven well and it's designed so well. Like if he gets a bite on someone, he has these two like AR 500 sharpened jaws that basically he can fight through any top armor someone puts. Like he has fought people with AR 500 top plates and just bit straight through it and then was just stuck in it. Like it's crazy. But yeah,
Dang,
going back to like how they
that's
view the
wild.
robot is yeah, how they view it as like a piece of art. Like it's a crusher robot. The face looks like the skull of like a wolf or something. Like he designed this thing and using the generative design, like it's insane how the parts came out looking like bones of like an animal. It's
That's
pretty wild to see.
I
But
remember I remember when generative AI or like generative design was first really starting to come out. I remember seeing they were trying to optimize drone bodies. And one of the things they said was like they were trying to optimize it for flight. And it ended up spitting out something that looked really weird at first, but then they realized that it looked basically like the pelvis of a flying squirrel is what it ended up coming up with, which was really crazy to see.
yeah,
Um, I want to be respectful of your time here, so
no,
I
you're
think I
good.
have maybe a couple more questions. Um, Well, actually, I want to make one comment talking about the Crusher robot and everything. That's
Yeah,
actually crazy to me to see that um, that there are different ways. There's a lot of ways now, it looks like, to win bots, where it's like in this case, right? Like you said, with them being a control bot, they need to drive really well. And again, they might be more fragile. So their tactic of how to win is going to be far different than, like you said,
yeah,
somebody with just a high you know high velocity weapon. It's like they just kind of have to drive forward and hope they run into you. And it's like
yeah,
it's really interesting how each design dictates the strategy for how they're going to win,
yeah.
and it's that there are a lot of different ways to do that.
Yeah, and there's also like a difference in philosophies between like that team Quantum is a great example. Like they don't look at their robot as disposable. They look at their robot as like a one-off piece of art, which I think is pretty cool in a way. Like they don't have spares of everything. One, because they machine it all themselves and it'd be take way too much time. I'm a But yeah, they look at the robot as like a one-off piece of art. They if they get killed, they get killed, and that's fine with them. Like they're okay with that. So that's like they're one of those teams that they're more concerned with building like the coolest thing they possibly can than winning, and they still come up with something really competitive, but they're still going to be at a disadvantage to all these big spinner weapons. Yeah.
Interesting. Just pivoting here, another
Yeah.
question I had, I wanted to focus a little bit on what college was like for you and what going through bots with college was like. Because for me, engineering school was like damn near all consuming, and
Mm-hmm.
it's a lot of work. I mean, and that's even before you talk about having a job or anything else. Just trying to get through your classes was
Yeah.
such a challenge. And how did you manage to do bots as well? And did you really, were there times where you really struggled to kind of balance that?
Yeah, for sure. Balancing college and BattleBots was really, really tough. I mean, what it came down to is like I would have to make really good use of my summers and winter breaks, and then like go home on some weekends, and that kind of like limited the amount of stuff, like amount of configurations of things we built. But we still always ended up with like a solid robot. But like I think the hardest part was like taking the 2 weeks off of school to go to the actual event. Like every single year of college and most years of high school, we were doing BattleBots or some other event. So pretty much every year of schooling in my life, I've had to take off 2 weeks to go to BattleBots or RoboGames or something else. So yeah, I think you just have to like get good at missing school and figuring out how to navigate that, and like you know figuring out how to properly word this email to this professor to so they can help you navigate this and like not make your life too difficult. But
Yeah, honestly,
yeah.
honestly, that was something I kind of learned going through school was like grades really didn't matter that much. And it's like, as long as you graduate with something reasonable, it was
Mhm.
almost more beneficial to have work experience, to have projects you had done.
Yeah,
Like that just seemed so much more applicable. And that's gotten me super far in terms of
yeah,
getting jobs and things. And so, as long as you can pass your classes, it's like at the end of the
yeah,
day, whether or not you showed up to every single lecture actually really doesn't seem to be that important.
yeah.
So, that's interesting.
Yeah, and like for me, I think like especially my like freshman and sophomore year of college, like I think even without BattleBots, like I struggled those years, and it was like hard to keep up with classes and things. And BattleBots made it even harder. So I think school might have been more stressful than BattleBots in those scenarios,
Oh
for
yeah.
sure.
Oh yeah.
But
I can
yeah,
imagine.
absolutely. But uh, but yeah, no, I got past those humps, and like I think I'm maybe if my like schooling suffered a little bit, I still don't think I would do much different, to be honest. I'm very glad I did BattleBots those years, and I'm still doing it. And yeah, I don't know, it's a crazy experience.
That kind of leads me into my last question here, actually, which would be if you had any advice, I guess, for either high school students, college
Mm-hmm.
students, maybe even focused on more high school. Well, I guess either, but who are looking, trying to figure out what they want to do, or just advice about what to look for in the beginning of their career, how to balance school and projects or friends. Any advice for, let's say, that younger generation who's up and coming on the
Mm-hmm.
engineering path or might want to be?
Yeah, I think one thing that might help a lot in like, because okay, so I think the hardest thing is like balancing different aspects of your life. But yeah, like I said, I think the if you're in like high school and want to really get in engineering or do BattleBots or some other interest, I think like if that's what you want to do, like I think you just kind of need to like accept that like part of your identity and like really like I don't know, just like hang out with people who do the same thing, like find that group of people who do the same stuff because like then that'll make your life easier because like if your friends have the same goal that you do, like that'll make it I don't know that much easier to do that thing and have people going through the same struggle. And that was one thing that maybe I didn't do. Like I didn't do like first robotics or anything in high school. Like it was as far as like BattleBots being my interest. Like I really only did it with my brother. And like had I like maybe done some like school team or something that was involved with that, like maybe that would have I feel like maybe that would have been helpful in some ways. So yeah, finding people with the same interests, super, super important. I mean, the same as like when you're taking a class, like having a group of people to study with and like friends in your class to hang out with, like that's super important to your grades for sure.
Yeah,
So same goes for BattleBots and things like that.
that's interesting that you say that, because that's totally true. Is that it's so much easier when you have a group of people to go down a path together
Mhm.
and to learn off one another. It's very difficult, and some people are better at it than others, but it's very difficult to go down a path in which
Mhm.
you don't have anybody else doing it with you or that you've
Mhm.
seen do it. And
Yeah.
so I attribute some of the path that I've chosen to be because I grew up around engineers. My dad
Yeah.
was an engineer, and when I was in high school, I took some classes and I did some, I did bots and things like that. And on top of that, I mean, I really enjoyed building stuff, but then seeing other people do it and seeing that the paths that were available, um, I think that really helped drive it home. So interesting. All right. Well, I'll be respectful of your time here, so we
Yeah.
can wrap this up. Thanks for chatting with me. It was really interesting to learn kind of about your experience with bots, how the show was going. I assume you are going to continue to do this as long as you
Yeah.
can.
Yeah, for sure.
So, anyways, thanks for chatting with me, and I hope you have a good rest of your weekend.
Yeah. No, thanks. It was a lot of fun. Thanks for inviting me on.
Anytime. All right. I'll talk to you later.